Good evening, everyone, and welcome. It is so good to see you here, and it's really good to have our guests here tonight. Thank you for being here at our Tippy McMichael lecture series presentation. As you know, Tippy McMichael was a lifelong member of this parish. Her time here was shaped by her grandparents, and following in their footsteps, she gave the palms for Palm Sunday every year. When she died, she left a sizable gift to St. Paul's, which supports many of the ministries of our parish, most notably our lecture series, which we offer in thanksgiving and memory of Tippy McMichael. We are also grateful for all of the individuals who have contributed to a wonderful reception this evening and to the members of the committee that helped make this lecture series possible. We are always looking for interested individuals who would like to be a part of that committee. If you would like to contribute your own time and your expertise, your own ideas to that group, we would love to hear from you. The table by the door where you walked in, there's a sign-up sheet. If you'll give us your name and some kind of contact information, an email address or a phone number, we will reach out to you. We would love to have you join us in that work. Before I talk about tonight's series, I want to remind you to mark your calendars for our next Tippy McMichael presentation this fall. In October, at the end of October, Frank Griswold, the 25th presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, who is now retired, will be with us. Frank, in addition to being the presiding bishop, is also quite the spiritual author and spiritual resource, and he will be with us to speak about not only his ministry as presiding bishop, but more importantly, his work as author and his work as a spiritual leader. Tonight, though, it's a treat to have Chester Johnson and Sheila Walker with us. Many of you were probably a part of the symposium at the university a few days ago. If you were not, you missed, I am told, a wonderful and very emotional experience. And I'm so grateful that Chester and Sheila are willing to share their own stories with us. Much of their talk tonight will be biographical, so I won't say much about them and let them do that themselves. But I will say welcome back to Chester, who has been a Tippy McMichael speaker before. Chester is an author, a novelist, an essayist, and a translator in the Episcopal Church. His work is known every week as we say the Psalms, the Psalter from the Book of Common Prayer that he and W.H. Auden worked on. His most recent manuscript, Damaged Heritage, from the Elaine Race Massacre to Reconciliation, is related to his remarks this evening, and we're glad that he is here. Sheila also grew up or was born in Arkansas, but at age 6 she moved with her siblings to Chicago. As a teenager, she was active in the civil rights movement, has been served as a law enforcement officer, served in the U.S. Army Reserves, and as a health educator. And their stories intersect in a beautiful way, and I look forward to hearing it, and I know you do too. Please join me in welcoming Chester Johnson and Sheila Walker.
It's gone green. Thank you, Evan. No, I don't. Well, it was turned. I just didn't have it turned properly. At the outset, I want to thank Father Garner and St. Paul's for having Sheila Walker and me here this evening. I've had the honor of speaking at St. Paul's as a Tippy McMichael lecturer, as Evan indicated, and for other occasions, including once when poet Miller Williams and I read a few of our poems at the Sunday Forum. So I feel like this evening is a bit of a homecoming. You haven't heard Sheila Walker previously, but you're in for a treat. You will walk away a changed person after hearing her. Sheila and I will be speaking tonight about a variety of matters associated with the Elaine Race Massacre and the Elaine Massacre Memorial, which will be dedicated next Sunday, September the 29th, in Helena, Arkansas, Phillips County, site of the massacre. On behalf of everyone involved with the memorial and its dedication, we are so pleased that there will be a large contingent from this church present for the dedication. Some are coming on their own, and others are taking a mini civil rights tour that will include the Elaine Massacre Memorial. Why don't I just run quickly through the key events related to the memorial over the 2 days as we see them. On Saturday, September the 28th at 2 p.m., we'll be in Elaine for an event focusing on the reconciliation at Turning Point Park in the middle of downtown Elaine. That evening, a dinner will be held at the University of Arkansas Medical Systems building in Helena. As they say, y'all come. That will be a time for much socializing and getting acquainted. Dr. Catherine Meeks, who was a recent McMichael lecturer here, will be in attendance since she is one of our 2 principal speakers at the dedication. The following morning, Sunday, September the 29th, there will be a service at St. John's Episcopal Church starting at 10:30 a.m. The Right Reverend Larry Benfield, Episcopal Bishop for the Diocese of Arkansas, will be there. Also, Father Ray Brown, rector of St. John's, who has been a stalwart supporter of the memorial efforts from the beginning. A luncheon sponsored by St. John's will follow the service, which will then lead to a short walk of a couple of blocks to Court Square Park, where the dedication of the memorial will be held. At 2 p.m., there will be a prayer service to begin the dedication with Bishop Benfield, along with the Methodist Bishop of Arkansas and other religious leaders, both local and outside the region. At the conclusion of the prayer service, we'll move right into other parts of the dedication with several speakers. After the dedication, which should be completed by 3:30, there will be a viewing of the memorial, a structure we believe is quite special, and a reception in the Phillips County Courthouse across the street from the memorial. Many of you are familiar with the massacre, but some of you aren't. So I thought I would very quickly recap the conflagration for everyone. The Elaine Race Massacre began on the evening of September the 30th, 1919 at Hoop Spur Church, located north of Elaine and nestled in cotton fields along Highway 44. The black sharecroppers were forming a local lodge of a union to combat the take-it-or-leave-it pricing of cotton by local white planters. The sheriff's office and the Missouri Pacific Railroad sent representatives to the church. At about 11 p.m., an exchange of gunfire between Union guards and the representatives who stood outside rang out with bullets passing through the church and with the official from the railroad being killed and the deputy sheriff being shot in the knee. White planters saw this action as the beginning of a black insurrection, motivated by returning African American veterans from World War I who expected to be treated with more equity after serving their country. The following morning, posses of white men were deputized and returned to the Hoop Spur area to begin shooting African American sharecroppers and family members. Plutocrats and county officials had sent out pleas to white men in surrounding communities and to Memphis and Mississippi for help. 2 white men were also killed that day, October the 1st, though possibly by friendly fire. A distress call was made by the county to the governor, who in turn asked for federal troops from Camp Pike near Little Rock to go to Phillips County to quell the black insurrection. By the end of the first day, 15 to 20 African Americans were dead, killed by the white posses. The white narrative ends there for the counting of African American deaths. However, based on reports that the U.S. Justice Department and the FBI completed over the next few days, the federal troops with their machine guns killed an additional 50 to 80 excuse me, African Americans. The total of African American deaths exceeded more than 100, but possibly hundreds perished. No one will ever know, of course. Now the second crucial stage of the massacre begins. Sharecroppers and some members of their families were tortured in the Phillips County Courthouse and jail in order for only the white narrative of the massacre to be the version heard in the local court. Politicians and plutocrats selected blacks to be prosecuted for various crimes and also selected the lawyers for the sharecroppers. Verdicts were determined by all-white juries in as short a time as 2 minutes. In late November 1919, 62 sharecroppers were sent to Cummins State Farm and 12 to the Walls Penitentiary in Little Rock to be executed. Sheila's great-uncle was one of the Elaine 12. At this point, a brilliant black attorney from Little Rock, Scipio Africanus Jones, and the NAACP entered the picture. In summary, within 5 years, all 74 convicted sharecroppers were free as a result of Jones and the NAACP's work. Most notable historically were the so-called Moore Six of the Elaine 12, whose case was decided in 1923 by the U.S. Supreme Court in Moore versus Dempsey on behalf of the sharecroppers. The decision, which found the torturing and conduct of the trials to be illegal, was written by Oliver Wendell Holmes and represented a landmark precedent. For the first time since the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, was passed in 1868, the Supreme Court altered its view that states were responsible for the civil rights of individuals residing in those states and thereby put teeth in the concept of equal protection under the law. With that summary of the massacre as background, let's move on now to the rationale for the memorial. Soon after I wrote a long article on the massacre that was serialized by a literary journal in 2013, a good friend of many years asked another good friend, also going back many years to my hometown of Monticello, Arkansas, why can't Chester leave Elaine alone? One local African-American man in Phillips County helped to answer that question by saying, we have swept the Elaine race massacre under a rug for 100 years, but we keep stumbling over the rug. Meaning, of course, that the local residents had yet to deal effectively through truth and reconciliation with the massacre, even after a century. But how does a memorial help answer the question, why can't Chester leave Elaine alone? Where there is no consensus on or attention to hard information, all rumors, recited folklore, excuses, alibis, intentional prevarications, and all other tales about an event have equal currency and validity. An advantage of a memorial in answering that question is to emphasize true accounts of the massacre. Where there is growing suspicion or countervailing facts about stories that could not have occurred based on the knowable components at play, the use of a memorial hastens the dissolution of fabricated history. By standing in direct contrast to those who divert by saying, forget the past, let's move on, the memorial recognizes the unfilled need for the community to come to terms with the massacre. In addition, for purposes of obviating true, untrue stories and representations concerning the massacre in particular, educational initiatives about the conflagration have run parallel in Phillips County with the design and construction of the memorial. Sheila and I, along with scholars such as Dr. Jenny Wayne here at the University of Arkansas, have participated in those local symposia for the Phillips County community. In fact, the more vociferous controversies that have arisen associated with the memorial do not relate to factually based history, which I believe has been largely resolved for most people. Moreover, the memorial helps to move the community through that history toward the purpose of greater local reconciliation. To that end, the Elaine Massacre Memorial Committee chose language for the memorial from the Old Testament, Ezekiel, chapter 37. Quote, "Never again shall they be two nations. Never again shall they be divided." Of course, the opening of the past cannot occur without controversy and response. In reaction to a televised program on the massacre and the proposed memorial by a Little Rock station, someone posted a response brazenly suggesting that the massacre should have been conducted statewide. Moreover, in late August of this year, someone surreptitiously chopped down a willow tree in the town of Elaine that had been planted some time ago in memory of those who died in the massacre. The person or persons also stole an associated sign. Let me say that there has been, of course, resistance to the memorial from those who dislike its location or its purpose or fear its ramifications. But the memorial is now complete, and we expect it to do its job for the community and beyond its community. Before turning to Sheila Walker, I have to say, in the context of the memorial, that without the Solomon family, a long-time, accomplished, devoted Jewish family of Phillips County, without the Solomon family, and David Solomon in particular, this memorial would never have become a reality. It is, in truth, that family's legacy to Phillips County and the region. Sheila Walker's ancestors experienced terrible onslaughts from white racists and white posses during the Elaine Race Massacre, while my own beloved maternal grandfather, Lonnie, participated in that conflagration. Nearly 6 years ago, Sheila and I were introduced by Robert Whitaker, author of On the Laps of Gods, which I highly recommend for those who want to know more about the massacre. Sheila and I represented the two sides, and Bob thought the two of us should talk. I won't take away any thunder from Sheila's presentation, but suffice it to say the two of us and our respective families have moved over the last nearly 6 years from truth-finding to reconciliation to friendship and love. It has been one of the more remarkable journeys of our lives. Here's Sheila to tell you more about herself and the journey. I have additional comments to make after she speaks.
Oh boy, this is falling. I'll just put this up here. Can everybody hear me? Good evening. I am so glad to be here. When I was asked by the rector to speak in Chester, I was like, what am I going to say? You know, that maybe Chester has not already talked to you about or whatever. But what Evan wanted me to talk about is my growing up. I was born in Arkansas. I left Hot Springs when I was 6 years old. I had no idea what racism was until I moved to Chicago. And one of the things that really stood out for me as far as racism, in that first year, I didn't know anything when I was 6. But a month after I turned 7 years old, Emmett Till was killed. And that was in August of 1955. And I was the type of child that kind of listened to what the adults say. You know, you're seen and not heard. I was seen, may have been seen, but I was listening and not commenting on what I heard. And I heard my mother and a cousin talk about going to view Emmett Till's body. And she did. And after she came home, she took us children and she just wept. And she says, I hope nothing like that ever happens to you. And it made me realize as a 7-year-old, I remember recall looking down at my hand and says, I could get killed because of my skin color. And I started paying attention. That's when I realized that skin color somehow mattered for me, whether it could be life or death or anything. That same year in 1955, growing up in Chicago, the winters are extremely, extremely cold. And if you may not notice now, but I have a scar here on my, right above my upper lip. It was too cold to go out to play for recess. So whenever it was too cold, the teachers would raise up the blackboards. And let me just kind of go back to that, the teachers. The school that I went to was totally segregated. This is Chicago. This is not in the Deep South. It was before the Little Rock Nine was segregated. And I noticed that everyone in the school, with the exceptions of the students, this is when I went back, this is after the Emmett Till death, I'm in 2nd grade, and I noticed that everyone in that school was white. From the principal, to the people that worked in the office, to the lunchroom attendants, to the janitors, everyone was white. It still hadn't really grasped me until I had that day, that winter day, we were playing tag, and I went up on a hook. They would have blackboards, and they would lower them over the coat room. And I went on a hook, and it tore my lip apart, my upper lip, and it went so deep that it tore part of my gums apart. And the teacher, instead of calling my mother or calling my older sister who was in the 3rd grade, or my brother my older sister was in the 4th grade, my brother was in the 3rd grade, to even take me home or to even call my mother to tell me that this happened. I sat there all afternoon, bleeding on a paper with a flesh-colored, y'all know what the flesh-colored Band-Aid. They didn't have African heritage or African American flesh color. They were white Band-Aid, soaking, dripping blood all afternoon until I got out of school and had to walk home with the blood basically freezing, my lip hanging. The Band-Aid had come apart. It was just a mess. And when my mother saw me, she just fell and says, oh my God, what happened and how did it happen and when did it happen? And I had to have not only stitches in my upper lip, but also on my gums. So at the time that it all happened, I didn't realize that this was racism. Whether it was conscious, the teacher was conscious of her racism or not. I wasn't valued as a human being to say, here's a child that's hurt, let me call their parent. Let me, take care of them. Let me make sure that she's okay. Let me call the doctors. Let me call an ambulance, something. None of that happened for me. So throughout my growing up, I was aware of racism. I don't need to tell you everything that happened to me as far as a child was concerned. But yeah, that happened. to me. So when we talk about Elaine, I didn't know anything about Elaine until I was after my grandmother's death, and I'll tell you what happened with her, because she was there during the massacre, and she witnessed her brothers being carted off to jail, and she witnessed all of that. But I didn't know anything about Elaine. And as that little child, living in Hot Springs, living with my grandmother, hearing conversation, I may have been 4, I don't think I was 5, about someone in my family going to the electric chair, or was sentenced to go to die in the electric chair, and I didn't know what that meant. But for some reason, as you know, you grow older, you hear about people being electrocuted because of the capital punishment. When I was 13, maybe 14, I was in the 8th grade. I took a book out of the library called On Death Row by Carl Chessman and read about his experience being on death row, and he was scheduled to be electrocuted. So that kind of framed my mind, and this is not good, this is not right. I don't believe in capital punishment to this day just because of that. And there's a reason why I don't believe in that, in capital punishment. I think that anyone that does something bad or terrible should have the time to reflect on what they're, unless they're inherently evil, and I don't think anybody is inherently evil born into this world. We're all God's children. That's not the way he designed us to be evil. So in 1973, I'm married now. I have a child that's coming on 2, and I go back to Hot Springs to visit my grandmother. And she starts to tell me a story. When I was a girl, something happened. These are her words. And she said, I had a premonition, something was going to happen. And then I was in that church, and shots were rang out, and people were dying in front of me, and I gathered up some children, and we got out through the back, and that was the end of all she could say, because she would start getting hysterical because of post-traumatic stress. There was no term for it then. In 73, nobody even said anything about post-traumatic stress. That was, the Vietnam era. That came a little bit afterwards, but that's what she was actually suffering from. And every time that I saw my grandmother, every time I tried to get her to tell me what happened, what exactly happened when you were a girl, the same result. She would get to a certain point, and that was it. So that's not how I found out about Elaine, but I knew something happened. After her death, and I mean, it could have been 3-4 years after her death, I was thinking about her because I was thinking about the relationship that she had with my mother, which my mother was an only child, and I couldn't see why they had such a turbulent type of relationship. And I always attributed to my mother was raised by her grandmother, my great-grandmother. And when my mother turned like 12 or 13, my grandmother took my mother from her mother to help her work and do domestic work in homes. So I thought that was it, because she wasn't raised by her mother. That was the reason why that relationship was kind of on shaky ground all the time. And so I called my mother. This is after my grandmother's death, and I said, what was she talking about? She says, well, your grandmother always had these fits. That's what she called the post-traumatic stress. And I didn't understand. I said, what do you mean? What was she talking about? What was she trying to say? And she said, oh, she must have been talking about the Elaine riots. What? What? The Elaine what? Elaine? She said, like the name Elaine, but they pronounce it Elaine. And I had just gotten a computer. I looked it up, read the white accounts, and a name stood out. It wasn't the first name, it was the last name, Giles, which is my grandmother's maiden name, which was my great-grandmother's name. And I was like, well, who is this Milligan Giles that's mentioned in the newspaper? My mother says, oh, that's your Uncle Jim. That's a whole nother story. I don't know how he became from Milligan to Jim. So I looked it up, and I read the accounts, and I was like, oh, wow. That, you know, the blacks were conspiring to kill the landowners, and what happened over the days, and all of that, I read that. And I just kind of left it alone. And periodically, I would go back, kind of, Google wasn't out then, but search it again and see something. And in 2000, I think I read something about a conference that they had either in Helena, I don't know exactly where it was, about the Elaine, they were still calling it riots. And I saw that someone spoke there, Griff Stockley, who wrote Blood in Their Eyes, and I immediately got that book and read that book. And I see my granduncle, Albert, who I never knew. He was deceased before I was born, 10 years before I was born, for that matter. And I see Milligan Giles, and now I know these are my granduncles. There was no mention of my grandmother or my mother, except for someone's testimony I read that my youngest uncle got shot in the face, and he was out going to see about his sister. And there was my grandmother, my grandmother. Time goes by, I read Griff Stockley's book, I put it down and says, wow, this is really something. So what am I gonna do with this? And then my daughter called me and she says, Mom, what was the name of your great-grandmother? And I said, Sally Giles. And she says, oh, I have this book, it's called On the Laps of God, and she's on the first page. And what were your uncle's names? I said, Milligan and Albert. And they're on the first page too. They're mentioned right off the bat in Robert Whitaker's book. What's the name of that book? She says, it's On the Laps of God. So I got that book and I read that book. I get a more detail, because Robert Whitaker is a journalist and he's writing it from a journalist perspective. It's as in-depth as Griff's, but Griff's is more on an academic level versus Robert Whitaker is more on a story. I'm telling you a story, but it's a factual story. These are the facts, and he's giving more information, more background. So I read this book, I put it down. This is about, when I read Bob's book, I think it was 2010, 2011, and I just left it alone. I read a lot of books about different things. I had this book called, in 2013, my youngest sister had passed away. She was drug addicted. These are things that happen in my family. I was raised poor, and sometimes, you know, being raised poor, some people just never can get out of that. I wouldn't consider, because this is a half-sister, but she was my youngest sister. And I was kind of pondering over, you know, how Isabel Wilkinson was following 3 families, and one of them was a family that migrated from Mississippi to Chicago. And what she noticed in interviewing with the families, that the children that were born in Mississippi they had a work ethic that was completely opposite to those children that were born in Chicago. And I saw that in my family. And I was sitting one night and I was like, something just says, see if you can get in touch with Isabel Wilkinson. And I Google her name and I'm trying to see if there's an email address, and I can't. And I was like pretty frustrated. Now it's after midnight and I get on the laps of God sitting on that same table, and something just says, see if you can get in touch with Robert Whitaker. And I sent him an email. I am the great-granddaughter of Sally Giles. This was after 12 midnight, a Saturday midnight. I didn't know whether he was going to read it or see it or whatever. Before 6 p.m. that Sunday, I had another email from Robert Whitaker saying that I was the first black African heritage descendant that's related to anyone from the Elaine massacre. When meeting Bob, he asked me if I wanted to meet another descendant from the other side. And I was like, okay, yeah. I said, yeah, okay. And then after I thought about it, I was like, okay, I'm going to be meeting somebody from the other side? I don't know how to take that, you know. Is it someone with white guilt? Is it someone why would he want me to meet this person? So time went on, maybe almost 6 months, and then he introduced me to Chester by way of email. Chester asked me to read an essay he had written for the Green Mountain Review before we talked. I read that essay. Because all up to that point, I was like, okay, here's somebody, got to take care of another white person and their racism. I got to do this. He's got this cold guilt. But there's something that stood out in that essay, the way he talked about his grandfather, Lonnie, and then knowing what Lonnie did. They were like two different people, almost, and how he couldn't reconcile that. And Chester and I talked maybe about a week later, if that long, and our first conversation lasted for over 2 hours. There was just a connection. I don't know what it was, and then when I met Chester, I told him we would be in Boston. He arranged to come to Boston, to my son's house, to meet me, and it was like we'd known each other forever, but not only that, there was an instant connection. And I had to tell him, you know, I forgive your grandfather. And he's like, kind of looked at me perplexed, and I was like, why would I forgive his grandfather who did such heinous things, whether it was against my family, but he participated in that massacre? And there was something about how he wrote it, the essay, that made me say, why would I even hold any animus to his grandfather? You know, I know about the times, what it was, and the fact that he wrote how sweet and loving his grandfather was. Something just clicked. Dr. King said you can have good people doing bad things, you know. And this could have been a good man who, because of the times, whatever the times was, or how he was raised, and everything that happened in the Jim Crow era and the era before that in enslavement, he had preconceived ideas about black people, which caused him to do what he did, be involved in what he did. I don't know what caused him, and I'm not going to excuse what he did, but I can forgive what he did. It's a lot easier for me to forgive than to hold on to something that will drag me down eventually. And that's what I told Chester. It's easy for me to forgive. When the relatives of those people that were killed in Charleston. Chester and I had that conversation maybe about a week or so ago. I said, I can see why they forgave Dylan Rue. I said, and I'm glad that he's not being sentenced to death, because he has time to reflect on what he did, and the fact that what he did was so terrible. He took away loved ones from someone else, and they forgave him. That's huge. He has time to reflect. He may be young and can't think about reflecting on that, but he will have time in his life to think about what he did and maybe forgive himself as well. So it's something that it was easy for me, and like I said, Chester and I have formed a relationship that I just can't even describe it when I try to tell people about the relationship. Well, they say, Chester's not you. I says, Chester's a person that has worked on whatever he grew up as a white person in the South. It's a constant work in progress in trying to be conscious of what white supremacy has come in on him, what racist tendencies or biases that have come in on him, to try to get them out of his life. And that's why I love him, because of the person that he is. And he shows me that he talks about innately human. Well, innately human, there is not like I said, there's not a child born on this earth that doesn't want that have these qualities of having an intelligence, to be loving, to just be immediately human without any other forces. Babies born, if you'll notice a baby is looking to get a connection with whoever is around him or her. That baby, that child is looking for some type of connection, and a baby don't see anything but another human being that they want to connect with. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sheila. I told you she'd change you. From the beginning, Sheila and I meant to be the obverse, the alternative universe to the attitudes and episodes that characterized the early fall days of 1919 in Phillips County, encompassing the massacre. Our friendship and reconciliation have continued to this day, with other family members being brought into this relationship. My wife and daughter and numerous members of Sheila's family. Our journey, Sheila and my journey, began as a mutual commitment to truth and reconciliation, with truth preceding reconciliation, which can only be a result of the truth when both parties are prepared to pursue the way forward. Non-acknowledgement or betrayal of the facts just leads to selfishness and pretension. And in the face of documented truth, adherence to white traditions just for the sake of following encrusted forms of behavior and response cannot progress beyond simplistic denials. So our journey, apparent from the outset, remained a road to reconciliation that recognized imperative history, which made sense of all we learned from beginning to end, discounting none of the most intrusive facts, regardless how uncomfortable. But we white folks, generally speaking, often had a problem with true reconciliation. Oh, there may be the seemingly affirmative comments about blacks and whites getting along, but that's not what reconciliation is. The getting along test doesn't solve it. There are several factors we can discuss that have played a role in this white dismissal of reconciliation, both racial and other. But one of the most germane aspects can be ascribed to a characteristic with a fancy name, filial pietism, or an excessive veneration of the past and tradition. Let me set the stage. Gettysburg constituted the deepest incursion in the Civil War by Confederate forces into the North for a major military engagement. And Pickett's charge constituted the most decisive battle at Gettysburg. Now let me read a short, pertinent excerpt by William Faulkner from his novel Intruder in the Dust. Quote, "For every Southern boy," Faulkner is referring to every white Southern boy. Focus on the word every. "For every Southern boy 14 years old, there is the instant when it's still not yet 2 o'clock on that July afternoon in 1863. The brigades are in position behind the rail fence. The guns are laid and ready in the woods, and the furled flags are already loosened to break out. And Pickett himself waiting for Longstreet to give the word, and it's all in the balance." Close quote. I don't know about you, but if every 14-year-old white Southern boy felt this fulsome urge to participate in Pickett's charge, I'd personally call that regional filial pietism. But maybe that's just me. Faulkner's remarkable assignment generations later to emotional, familial, and regional sympathy or empathy with forebears. Faulkner, who unquestionably adopted filial pietism for his art, realized he could tap into that regional white sensibility and mythology. Was it the defeat that was so attractive to 14-year-old Southern white lads? The lost cause? Was it the defense of a regional way of life, including slavery and the subjugation of black Americans? Is the romanticized version for Pickett's charge offered up by Faulkner a dangerous and generous helping of misplaced reverence? Here is the conundrum. Whole careers get based on excessive veneration of the past and tradition. Many politicians, even writers, very well-known writers, have relied on veneration of the past and tradition to create a perpetual adherence to our damaged heritage. Speaking personally, I am a product of damaged heritage, and many of you are as well. It's not just Lonnie, my grandfather, though he is an important figure in my own damaged heritage. For many of my ancestors were slave owners, and that is probably true for some of you as well. So we white Southerners are locked into this remarkable state of an excessive veneration of the past, while at the same time being subject to damaged heritage. So what do? We don't talk about it, do we? We hope the subject moves on to something else. While writing my new book that deals with many issues in the massacre and is entitled Damaged Heritage, From the Elaine Race Massacre to Reconciliation, a book whose foreword is written by Sheila Walker, I interviewed a number of white folks in the Arkansas Delta. And several told me it would be best if I left everything about Elaine alone. Just be quiet about it. Why? Because we whites know that our heritage is damaged, and we don't want to keep being reminded of it. We white Southerners are tied to that associated venerated tradition and past like an infant to mother's milk. And I'm tied to it in so many ways. Probably half of the poems I've written are in some way tied to the South and my experiences here in the South. We are creatures aligned or askew with our past, meaning that in the case of Elaine, unless folks are willing to confront and restructure that past to evince its truth and reality, they are destined to live out a false past that can also make them false in the present. This is no small matter, for truth brought forward affects the way we act and react today and tomorrow. Based on revised and true history, we inevitably adjust our current behavior. So how do we whites get out of this predicament of giving the past too much reverence and more than enough benefit of the doubt, while then refraining from correct admission of our damaged and in so many ways violent heritage? History has proven over and over again that we can't normally look to ourselves to solve the problem, not in any pervasive sense. Speaking personally, while Lonnie remained separately my beloved grandfather and a person who participated in the massacre, Sheila proved to be a godsend. She circumvented my struggles with the ribbon composite of the two images of Lonnie by simply announcing, both publicly for occasions such as this one and privately to my family and me, that she forgave Lonnie more than I had or could. By forgiving Lonnie for his role in the conflagration that produced attacks against her victimized ancestors, she deflated the potency of the damaged part of that tradition. By her forgiveness of Lonnie on the broad scale of his tendentious racist opinions and conduct and role in the Elaine Race Massacre, she conveyed to me the assurance that I could proceed with her to friendship through a closer dialogue, shared views, and personal stories. A shared purpose, if you will. And on this foundation, a willingness and aspiration could spread and unfold between us. It is indeed awkward and probably a bit presumptuous even to refer to a proposed moral conduct for the historically and racially oppressed and separated African Americans. Still, without the prospect for forgiveness exercised by those who have sustained white aggression, conflagration, and subjugation, and who continue to carry long-term effects of the associated oppression, there is unfortunately less chance for reconciliation. In a quite special and consequential way, we have understood that white Southerners needed forgiveness for their damaged heritage. The historically oppressing parties are simply not able to forgive themselves. We have had no resources for achieving this goal. But the act of forgiveness elevates African Americans from their subjugation and at the same time releases whites to be free of the deeper presence of damaged heritage. Sheila provided a blessed outcome from our reconciliation because she realized the limitations for whites to address fully the past with self-forgiveness or self-instituted redemption. Why is damaged heritage so insidious? It has been fed to us without our agreeing to be fed. We simply had no say in the matter. In both spoken and unspoken ways, our damaged heritage imparted a whole universe involving the treatment of folks of color, the inculcation of an attitude toward blacks, and an expectation of the ways that blacks would wish to treat whites. This is not to say we, who were recipients of this tainted universe and tradition, this damaged heritage, didn't have an ability to abrogate the spoiled milk. but it took significant effort and oftentimes many years or a special epiphany to obviate the effects. Some 170 years ago, the philosopher, some call him a theologian, Søren Kierkegaard, stated in his classic Fear and Trembling that a person never learns anything genuinely human from a previous generation. This conclusion, on the face of it, is rather hard to take, for we somehow think that we evolved from more primitive and brutal ways of behavior and attitudinal thinking. Still, I assume Kierkegaard was talking about something quite different. In a much larger sense, a challenge exists for every generation to accept and advocate willingly that the commonality between humans far outweighs any differences in custom, history, background, skin color, language, dialect, manners, and rituals. Unfortunately, however, these very minimal differences suggest to some the perfect reason for exclusion, separation, and isolation of others. Thus, racism for every generation repeats itself in varying degrees for the simple reason that some whites show little desire to accept continuously and committedly the genuinely human in Black Americans. Relatedly, it is surely not possible to attain true reconciliation, not accommodative and temporary reconciliation, but true reconciliation between individuals of a different color without finding the genuinely human both in others as persons and in the community of individuals whose history, background, accents, customs, and traditions are different, possibly radically different from one's own. Regarding the relationship that developed out of our mutual history from the Elaine Race Massacre, Sheila and I powered our journey with the genuinely human as a steadfast election on which we depended. Without even articulating the steps that led us, Sheila and I readily resolved to treat each other in contradiction to the characteristics that were in unrestrained supply during the fall of 1919 in Phillips County at the time of the white attacks and in their immediate aftermath. We chose respect over degradation, goodwill over control, truth over mendacity, comedy over manipulation, and compassion over torment. Sheila and I can call our efforts racial reconciliation, but I believe our reconciliation goes beyond that, which, as a concept, suggests a certain limitation that I do not believe actually applies. In the vernacular, the term for true reconciliation has a theological basis. He and us, we and him. But the concept is not just God to man or woman. There's a quite human dimension to this idea of he and us, we and him, for relationships that are person to person. In other words, we are part of that common humanity whereby we are bound one to another. It is the doctrine that no person lives to herself or himself. When one is reconciled, I believe this is what the result should be. Charles Williams, a British writer of the last century, called this concept the human process, which I've tried to articulate in the formation of reconciliation. He called it coherence, a word we haven't heard often, but it embraces the idea of inherence, or those inherent qualities that are common to all human beings and shared with one another, as in the use of thus the word co-inherence. Sheila and I discussed these ideas as formulating reconciliation, including but not limited to racial reconciliation. She had conversations with members of her family about it, as I did with my own, and we collectively agreed, as one member of Sheila's family stated, that is it. Yes, that is it. Obviously, we have covered a a wide landscape tonight with issues pertinent to the Elaine Race Massacre, including the impact of matters that are normally less evaluated, matters such as damaged heritage, the genuinely human, coherence, and filial pietism. In the end, most of these concepts should lead us, crucially and caringly, to a place of reconciliation between African Americans and white folks. It is there that people are more humanely humanely treated when reconciliation has been achieved. When reconciliation strips away a previous context and replaces it with a more direct, candid, conducive, sympathetic, responsive, and realistic one. One that is more personal. One that has set aside the evils and ravages of damaged heritage and filial pietism. One that has more fully taken on coherence, empathy, agape love, and the adoption of the genuinely human. To receive another's condition captures the will of one's own purpose, thus finding oneself in the place of another. For someone connected to the oppressing side, forgiveness by those who have been oppressed can remove the dominance of a seemingly immutable past transmuted to the present. For someone associated with the oppressed, to be coherently bound to a representative of past oppression is to transfer freedom to that person. And the act of imparting freedom can serve as an illumination and passage to a consciously elevated relationship, individually and ultimately for whole communities. The relationship about which I write is an endeavor between individuals, not between institutions. Therefore, we are left to ourselves, simply as we should be, to give and receive reconciliation, to love each other, if you will, for the chance is indeed ours, as one and another, black and white, both to reach well beyond those cruel assumptions our racial history declaims in terrible events and conflagrations like the Elaine Race Massacre, and to be more than our collective past has ever promised we could be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila and Chester. Thank you. We are a little over time, but I wonder if we might sit for just a moment and ask maybe 2 questions. Would 2 or perhaps 3 people who have a question be willing to ask? And I'm going to look for, thank you, Trent, to come and help me with a microphone. Anybody have a question for either or both? Hershey, thank you.
Thank you both for being here and for starting this week that will culminate, I guess, next Sunday. I was struck this week listening to the PSAs on our public radio station talking about the Elaine tragedy and what would be taking place Thursday at the Pryor Center and here tonight. Could you talk about the use of that word tragedy in reference to Elaine?
Well, it was just sharecroppers trying to organize to get an equitable amount of money for the cotton that was grown, just to get half. That would have made a great difference to the sharecroppers and their families and the lives that they were living. Possibly in the year of 1919, they would have been able to buy their own land, farm their own land, and it would benefit their families. So it was a tragedy, the tragedy of what happened to the Johnson brothers, the tragedy that happened to the black people in the lane who were not conspiring just because they wanted some kind of equitable, to be equitable, get equitable amount of money for the crop that they had raised.
I guess my response to that is that, you know, this event was originally called a riot. And I just never identified with it. And not just in terms of the white press. I mean, Ida B. Wells wrote the first treatise on this, and she called it the Arkansas Race Riot. It's a way in which things get characterized. Tragedy is sort of Shakespearean way of defining something. And I would, if I'd been the scribe of writing that text for the public radio, I just wouldn't use tragedy. Tragedy is sort of a bastardized version of something that really happened in a significant way that was absolutely awful. And the closest word that we can find is a massacre. I mean, it should, in some ways, tragedy leaves a milquetoast kind of interpretation of what it really meant, what it meant. It might be even worse than the use of the word riot. But these events need to be called what they are. And I know that one of the authors that Sheila mentioned, won't tell which one, but I'll say that this particular writer said, the worst thing I ever did in my life was not calling the book that I wrote the Elaine Race Massacre. I mean, you look at both of those books, I'm not going to say which one said it, but blood in their eyes and on the laps of gods. And neither of them really underscored the reality of what happened at that time. The closest we have is the massacre. The word that sort of, and the other word that fits, or doesn't, none of these fit. I mean, when you look at an event like that, but the closest we can come is massacre or conflagration. I mean, those are the two that I think come, the closest to what exactly happened. It sure isn't a riot, and it sure isn't tragedy. Tragedy can happen, and, two people, they decide to split up, and that's a tragedy. Well, this is a hell of a lot worse than that. Mm-hmm. So,
thank you. Another question. Mike, in the back. Here comes hold on for the microphone.
I will try to articulate this question and challenge, by the way. You have forgiven Chester, his ancestry. You have forgiven him. Remarkable process that you describe. In the presence of Chester trying to forgive his history. You come to this both with two cells of information, one being your both personal experiences. Somehow it merges up in the middle and you say, hey, I can talk to this person. We are in a time, racism is still alive and well. We have African American kids who are out in the streets killing each other. White people who are killing blacks, okay? They don't have benefit of that cell of information. Does that make sense? How do you propose, or what would you suggest? Not solution, but as we approach this middle of forgiving and being forgiven, how do we articulate language of fairness in a very troubling time that is very tragic to our young people?
Thank you. Responses?
I have to say that saying that blacks killing blacks your whites killing whites as well. So we can just toss that out, toss that right on out. About the racial climate in this country, it's not going to change unless white people work on their own racism, talking to other white people about race. It's uncomfortable to talk about racism, especially for you white people. It's not uncomfortable for us because we're the targets of it, or people of color. We're targets, so it's not uncomfortable for us to talk about it. But to talk about it amongst yourselves, become more aware, more conscious of what's around you, what's racially, how the media portrays African American or people of color. Just to be aware, raise your self-awareness, kind of stretch your whole point of view. It will make a difference. And to work on things that you never even considered to be racist, because I know white people look at racism as those that are, there's a binary. There's those that say, oh God, this guy is outright racist because he uses the N-word or he hates black people, et cetera, et cetera. And then I don't use that. That's not part of me. I think everyone is human, but you're not really working on your own inner biases to kind of disperse them and figure out where they came from and how to get rid of them so that you could stretch your worldview. You could stretch yourself to say, well, I'm not looking at the differences, I'm looking at people as people. Thank you.
No, I don't have.
Thank you. Okay. One more. Thank you. There in the back.
Thank you both for being here. Several years ago, I heard on NPR about massacres in southern Missouri and northern Arkansas, about how whole towns of black folks, successful towns, were wiped off the map, burned, people killed. And that's the first I'd heard of it. I'd always wondered why there were no people of color, or very few people of color up here, but that had a lot to do with it. And then just recently, in the past couple of weeks, because of the talks that you're giving and that the Pryor Center is doing this week, I've learned so much more about the massacres and killings that happened after the First World War when our soldiers came home. And they happened all across the country. Chicago, New York, here in Arkansas, and it has floored me that we weren't taught this in school, and many of us had what we thought were good educations, but having the truth brought to light, it's painful, but it's what we need to know to work through it and to truly see each other as humans. And I'm going to read those books and talk about them with my friends, my family, so that I can evolve and they can evolve, because it's important. And I look forward to reading your book, Chester, about damaged heritage.
Very good. And everybody else ought to buy it.
Yeah. Because we know it, we live it, we see it in the people around us. And anyway, thank you so much.
Any closing comments from either of you or responses?
I can suggest another book to read as well. There's a lot of books out there. White Fragility If you've heard of it, read it. It's a very good book, as well as Chester's book, which I've read. It sheds a light, but there's so many books out there. There's so many documentaries out there that will just shed light. And I can give you two of them. One of them is Race, the Power of an Illusion. It was presented to PBS some years ago, but it's eye-opening because they talk about race, what it means, what it is, etc. And another one is called Unnatural. It isn't an author. It's a video. It's called Race. You can go to pbs.org and put in Race, the Power of Illusion, and you can buy that DVD. Maybe the church will buy it and show it because it's worth watching. It will increase your awareness. Another one is called Unnatural Causes, and it's about how racism has caused a lot of health problems in the African American community, the impact of racism. And that's on pbs.org as well.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on the woman's comment because I think the point that you're making has been so pervasive, and it's actually part of, I believe, damaged heritage. I'm sorry, I can't turn. Well, do you know how to turn those things out? Anyway, so.
It's Frida.
I don't know how to do anything. But it's really part of, it's probably Frida, right?
It is Frida.
It's really part of damaged heritage. And the reason I'm responding is very sensitive to, it was very sensitive to issue because in 2008, I was asked by the Episcopal Church to write the litany of offense and apology when the Episcopal Church decided to formally apologize for its role in slavery and related evils. And as I was going through and doing all my research and et cetera, I found out about this event. I won't go through all of that, but I began to inquire of I've maintained some close relationships with my high school classmates, some of them, and so I reached out to them. I said, we never studied this in Arkansas history. It was never, there was nothing about this. And they, maybe one of the 4 or 5 people I talked to had heard of it, but that's about it. And that is a real travesty to us as whites, that we don't understand. I mean, that's one of the problems with damaged heritage, is we don't really know how much damaged heritage we have. I mean, we haven't been confronted with the truth of it because there's been so much of it that has been left silent or obfuscated or just forget it, let's move on. And that is a real travesty. And I would hope that that is an area that will be given increased attention to make sure that this type of that the education includes this type of disclosure. So,
Thank you. Thank you.
thank you, Sheila.
Thank you, Sheila and Chester, for being here. Thank you all for being here. If you are interested in this conversation, if you're interested in speaking to other people about the effects that racism continues to have on us and on our culture, I want to offer 2 additional resources for you. One, first, this coming Saturday, a week from today, as Chester mentioned, 40 or so people from this community are headed to Memphis, to the Civil Rights Museum, to spend the night, and then to be in Helena on Sunday morning for the commemoration, the centennial of the Elaine Massacre and the dedication of the monument. Join us. We've got room for about 10 more individuals. The cost is around $150, and scholarships are available. If you are available next Saturday morning through Sunday evening, join us. Another opportunity is the Becoming Beloved Community, which meets here on the first and third Wednesdays of the month at 7 o'clock. You are invited and you are welcome to be a part of that ongoing conversation. Thank you both for being with us and for sharing your story. And thank you all for being here as well. If you're interested in joining the Tippy McMichael committee, there's a sign-up sheet by the door. If you'd like to know more about the pilgrimage or about Becoming Beloved Community, speak to me before you leave. Thank you so much.
Thank you.